Of course, here is the rewritten story, optimized for viral YouTube storytelling. The train didn't just stop, it screamed. It was the sound of a dying animal, metal grinding on metal, and it coughed a final gray breath of steam into the cold October air. This was it, Ironwood Junction. For Eleanor Nora Hayes, that name had once sounded like a song, a promise whispered across 1,000 miles. Now stepping onto the cracked wooden platform, it just sounded like an ending. Her hands, hidden in worn leather gloves, gripped the handle of her carpet bag so tightly her knuckles were white. Beneath the simple wool of her traveling dress, a dress she had stitched and restitched with trembling fingers, her heart was a trapped bird, beating its wings against her ribs. She'd spent her last dollars on this journey, on this dress, on the second-hand hat with its single velvet ribbon. A veil, pinned just so, hid the left side of her face, the ruined side. She scanned the crowd, a blur of strange faces and hurried bodies. Then she saw him. He stood out like a hawk among pigeons. Charles Pennington, tall, trim, with a dark wool coat that had gold embroidery at the cuffs. He looked exactly like his letters, a man who owned things, a man who got what he wanted. He swung down from a handsome chestnut horse and walked toward her, his stride full of a confidence that had never known a single day of doubt. This was the moment. Her future was walking toward her. Nora took a steadying breath, her fingers finding the edge of the thin veil. She stepped forward into his path, and she lifted it. For a single terrible heartbeat, his confident stride faltered. It was just a hitch, a tiny stumble. But for Nora, it was a canyon opening up at her feet. The world went silent. The wind snapped at her skirt. A crow cried out overhead, a sound like a tearing cloth. Charles stopped a few feet from her. His eyes, which had been warm in his letters, were now chips of ice. They weren't looking at her. They were looking at her cheek, at the scar. Then he spoke, and his voice sliced the air into 1,000 tiny pieces. "You lied." Just 2 words, but they hit her harder than a fist. "You didn't mention that." His chin jutted toward the pale, ragged river of flesh that fire had carved across her skin. Nora's hand fluttered up, a reflexive gesture to cover the thing he was staring at with such disgust. I told you I'd been in a fire," she stammered, her voice a stranger in her own ears. "I said it was a minor injury." "Minor?" He barked the word, a sharp, ugly sound. He glanced around, suddenly aware of the people on the platform. The freight man who had stopped loading his cart. The woman with 2 small children who were now staring openly. He didn't lower his voice. He raised it. "My God, woman, I'm not marrying someone who looks like a goddamn nightmare." He wanted them to hear. He wanted them to be his witnesses. "You tricked me. You wrote pretty letters and you misled me." Her throat was closing up, tight and hot. "But your letters, you said beauty didn't matter. You said you wanted a partner, someone with a good mind who could work beside you." Charles let out a cruel laugh. He was holding a small bouquet of wildflowers, already starting to wilt. He tossed them to the ground between them. "That was before I saw you," he sneered. He was already turning back to his horse, his hands reaching for the reins as if touching them could wash the sight of her away. "Find someone else to pity you. I won't be tied to a freak." The carpet bag slipped from her numb fingers. It landed on the wooden planks with a dull thud that echoed the sound of her heart hitting the bottom of her chest. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. No protest, no plea. There was nothing left to say. Her fingers, deep in her pocket, closed around the last letter he'd sent. The paper was soft and worn from how many times she'd read it, tracing the words that had felt like a lifeline. "I'm not looking for a beauty queen, Nora. I'm looking for someone real." He had been the liar, not her. He had lied about everything. Someone behind her whispered, "Poor thing." The pity was worse than the disgust. It was a blanket being thrown over a corpse. With shaking hands, Nora bent down and picked up her bag. As she straightened, her boot came down on the crumpled bouquet, crushing the petals into the dirty wood. A gust of wind tore at her veil, whipping it free from its pin. She didn't bother to fix it. Let them look. Let them all see the monster Charles Pennington had named her. She walked, away from the whispers, away from the stairs. Her boots clicked on the platform, a lonely rhythm in a world that had suddenly gone silent. She found an empty bench by the freight shed, as far away from the main station as she could get, and she sat. The sun began to bleed across the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of dying orange and bruised purple. She watched the color drain from the world and felt it draining from her, too. She had come all this way to start a new life. Instead, she had been left behind. An unwanted package. A wound no one wanted to see. And even as the cold settled deep into her bones, she did not cry. Crying was a luxury for people who still had hope. Her hand, calloused from years of needlework, just curled tighter and tighter around that letter in her pocket, the paper crinkling like dry leaves. Behind her, somewhere in the growing darkness, a single bootstep echoed on the planks. She didn't turn. She wouldn't. She had already learned what happens when you let yourself hope. The last train whistle had faded hours ago, a mournful cry swallowed by the canyons. The station was deserted, a skeleton under a sky full of cold, distant stars. Nora sat frozen on the bench, the chill of the woods seeping through her coat. She had nowhere to go. No money for a ticket back east, and nothing to go back to anyway. She was an island, and the tide was coming in. "Miss Hayes!" The voice came from the shadows behind her. It wasn't loud, but it was low and steady. It held no pity, no scorn. It was just a voice, a fact. She flinched, turning, expecting to see the station master telling her to move along, or worse, some town drunk looking for sport. But it was neither. The man who stood there was tall, his frame lean under a dust-worn coat. A sheepskin collar was turned up against the cold, and a wide-brimmed hat shadowed most of his face. He held something out to her. Her hat, the one with the velvet ribbon. It must have fallen when the wind took her veil. He wasn't holding it out to her like it was trash. He held it in both hands carefully, as if it was something precious. "Figured you might want this," he said. She took it without a word, her fingers brushing his for a half-second. His gloves were rough, worn leather. She pulled the hat into her lap, clutching it like a shield. "You can go now," she muttered, her voice raw. "Go on about your day like everyone else did." He didn't go. Instead, he walked to the far end of the long bench and sat down. He left a good 6 feet of space between them. He wasn't crowding her. He wasn't pressing. He was just there. The wind stirred the dust around his boots. After a long, heavy silence, he spoke again, his voice still quiet. "Luke Carter. I run some cattle a few miles west of here. Was in town for supplies when your train pulled in." Nora said nothing. She stared straight ahead at the dark shape of the hills against the even darker sky. What did he want? "I saw what that man did," Luke Carter continued, his tone even. "I've seen jackals with better manners." Her throat tightened into a knot. "I don't need your defense," she snapped, the words sharper than she intended. "And I certainly don't need your pity, especially not from someone pretending they could possibly understand." The words hung there in the cold air, brittle and ugly. She expected him to get up, to leave her to her misery, but he didn't. Instead, he did something that made her breath catch in her throat. He slowly turned his head, letting his face come fully into the faint moonlight. The right side was lean and weathered, but the left side was a road map of old pain. A burn scar, jagged and pale, climbed from his jawline all the way up to his cheekbone. It looked like lightning had been captured in his flesh. "Not pretending," he said, his voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. Nora couldn't look away. She stared at his scar, and he stared right back at her. His wasn't like hers. His was older, deeper, but it was the same language, the language of fire. On him, it didn't look grotesque. It looked real. She saw past the scar to his eyes. They were the color of river ice in the winter, but there was something warm burning deep in their center. "The war?" she asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. He gave a single slow nod. "Shiloh. And you?" The question hung between them, an invitation. She almost answered, but the bitterness rose up again. "You think that makes us the same?" He shrugged, a slow movement of his broad shoulders. No, just means I know what it's like. When folks stop seeing a person and only see the part they think is broken. He paused. I've got a bunkhouse. It's got a stove with a fire in it, a clean bed, and a pot of stew that's probably not burnt yet. You can stay a few nights. Get your bearings. Think on what's next. He looked her straight in the eye. No strings, no questions. Just a quiet place to be. She turned fully toward him then, ready to refuse. Ready to tell him she didn't take charity. But the look on his face stopped her cold. It wasn't pity. It wasn't some kind of misplaced gallantry because she was a woman in trouble. It was something else. It was recognition. He was offering her a safe harbor not because she was a woman, but because he knew what it felt like to be shipwrecked. She studied him for a long moment. The scarred face, the quiet strength, the fact that he hadn't once used the word beautiful or ugly. He just waited, letting her decide. Finally, her own voice, barely a whisper, asked the question that was screaming inside her. Why? He tipped his head, considering it. Because when that man yelled, every single person on that platform looked away from you. They looked at the ground, at the sky, at their own feet. Anyone but you. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, deeper. And because he was wrong, her breath hitched. Who says you're not beautiful? He stood up then, dusting off his gloves. He didn't wait for an answer. He just pointed with his chin toward a horse tied up in the shadows. My place is that way, he said. I'll ride slow. You follow, if you choose. And with that, he turned and walked away. He didn't look back to see if she was coming. He left the choice entirely, completely in her hands. Nora sat there alone on the bench, the cold night air wrapping around her. She could stay here and freeze. She could try to walk to the next town and hope for a kindness that probably wouldn't come, or she could follow the scarred man into the dark. She reached for her carpet bag, and she stood up. The bunkhouse wasn't much, but it was the warmest place Nora had been in a year. It smelled of cedar wood, old leather, and wood smoke. A single room with a stone hearth where a fire crackled merrily. A narrow bed with a clean quilt folded at the end. A small table and 2 chairs. It was simple, but it was solid. It was safe. She stood just inside the doorway, her bag still clutched in her hand, her shoulders still braced for a blow that wasn't coming. Luke had already moved away, giving her space. He was at the stove, the soft clink of a tin ladle against an iron pot the only sound in the room. He didn't fuss over her. He didn't watch her. He just let her be. Stew's rabbit and beans, he said, his back still to her. Nothing fancy, but it's hot. He ladled a generous portion into a thick wooden bowl, set it on the small table, and placed a cup of water beside it. Then he went back to the fire, busying himself with adding another log. You eat. I'll be outside for a bit. He left without another word. She was alone. Slowly, cautiously, she walked to the table and sat down. The chair creaked, but held her weight. She picked up the spoon. The stew was thick and savory. With the first bite, a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the warmth of a simple kindness, given with no expectation of anything in return. Each spoonful was an anchor, pulling her back from the cold, empty place she'd been floating in. As she ate, her eyes scanned the small room. It was a man's space, sparse and practical. A rifle mounted over the hearth, a stack of worn books on a crate, a small dresser near the bed, and on that dresser there was a small oval mirror. But it was covered. A piece of clean cotton cloth had been draped over it, not hidden away in a drawer, just veiled. Something in her chest twisted tight. He had thought of that. He had known without her saying a word that the last thing she would want to see was her own reflection. He had known what it was like to be afraid of your own face. The days that followed fell into a quiet, gentle rhythm that was so foreign it almost hurt. Luke was gone before the sun was up, riding out to check on his small herd of cattle. He'd return at dusk, smelling of dust and leather and the clean, cold air of the high country. He never asked her what she did all day. He never pressed her to talk. He just existed in the space with her, a silent, steady presence. And in that silence, Nora started to heal. She found a broom and swept the floor. She boiled water and washed her few clothes, hanging them to dry near the fire. She found a needle and thread in a small tin box and mended a tear in the curtain. Small tasks. Simple things. But they were hers. They made her feel less like a guest and more like a person again. She was careful to keep the scarred side of her face turned away from him, a habit so ingrained she did it without thinking. But she started to notice that Luke never did. He never shied away. He never flinched. When he spoke to her, he looked at her, all of her. One evening, a week after she arrived, she found him on the small porch, sharpening a knife by the light of a lantern. The stars were scattered across the black velvet sky like spilled diamonds. She wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders and went out, sitting on the top step a few feet away from him. The only sound was the rhythmic shh of the stone against the steel blade. "My father died when I was 16, she said, her voice so soft it was nearly lost to the night. The words just came out, unbidden. "My mother a year later. The fire. The fire was after that. I was supposed to marry a man back in Kansas, a childhood friend. But when he saw me after, he couldn't look at me. He just couldn't." Luke didn't say anything. He just kept sharpening the knife, the motion smooth and unbroken. His silence was a space for her to put her words into. It wasn't empty. It was listening. "I thought this time," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "I thought Charles was different. I guess I was a fool to hope." He set the knife in the stone down on the step beside him. He looked out into the darkness. "I was married once," he said, his voice low and rough. "Before the war. Her name was Mary. She was small, and she laughed like a creek in the springtime." He paused, and Nora could feel the weight of his next words before he even spoke them. "She died of a fever while I was away at Shiloh. I got the letter 3 months after they buried her." The quiet ache in his voice was a physical thing. "I'm so sorry, Luke," she said gently. He shrugged, but she saw the muscle in his jaw tighten. "Some wounds, they never really heal. They just stop bleeding." The wind sighed through the pines. Far off in the hills, a coyote let out a long, lonely howl. The sound seemed to pull something raw and broken out of her. "I have nothing left," she confessed to the night. "No home, no family, no face anyone can look at." Luke turned his head then and looked at her, and in his eyes she saw no pity. She saw no charity. She saw the same raw, broken thing that lived inside her. "Then we start there," he said. She blinked, confused. "Start where? With nothing?" "Exactly," he said, his voice firm, unwavering. "With that." And for the first time in a very, very long time, she believed him. She believed him not because he promised to fix her or save her, but because he looked at her nothing, and he wasn't afraid. He just stayed. Her scar was still there, a permanent shadow on her face. But for the first time, it didn't feel like it was the only thing in the room. He was there too. The whispers started like a slow poison, seeping into the town's water supply. At first it was just looks, the way the women at the trading post would stop talking the moment Nora stepped through the door. The way the storekeeper's wife would suddenly find something fascinating to look at on the floor. But soon the looks turned into mutters, and the mutters turned into stories. She was the disfigured woman from the train, the one who got left on the platform, and now she was shacked up with that quiet, scarred man out on the Carter Ranch. The town of Ironwood Junction didn't need the truth. They just needed a good story to chew on, and a fallen woman was the tastiest story of all. Nora felt their judgment like a physical weight. It was in the air, thick and suffocating. One morning she was sitting by the bunkhouse window, watching Luke ride out toward the hills, a dark silhouette against the rising sun. The warmth from her tea mug did nothing to fight the chill that was spreading through her. It was the old shame, coiling in her gut. But this time, it was worse. It wasn't just her they were judging. They were judging him too, because of her. By the time he came home that evening, his face weary from a long day, she had made up her mind. Her carpet bag was packed and sitting on the table. "I'm leaving in the morning," she said, before he even had a chance to take off his coat. "I can't thank you enough for your kindness, Luke, but I won't be the reason this town turns on you." Luke didn't look surprised. He just pulled off his gloves, slapping them against his thigh to knock the dust off. He set them on the mantel. "They're already talking," he said, his voice calm. "Have been for days." "Then that's all the more reason for me to go," she insisted, her voice trembling slightly. He crossed the small room and leaned against the stone hearth, folding his arms across his chest. He looked at her, his eyes steady. "I walked through the hornet's nest at Shiloh, Nora. I've had Confederate lead dug out of my ribs, and I breathed in so much cannon smoke I thought my lungs had turned to ash." He paused and his voice dropped lower. "But the hardest thing I've ever had to do is walk into a room full of people and feel it go quiet just because I'm there." She looked away, unable to meet his gaze. She knew that feeling too well. "And still," he continued, his voice like iron, "I walk in, every single time." Her throat was tight. "I can't be the reason you lose your peace, Luke. The peace you found here." He took a step closer, and then another, until he was standing right in front of her. "Then let me be the one to decide what my peace looks like." That evening, he did something she never expected. He took her into town. She protested, begged him not to, but he was resolute. "They're going to stare, Nora," he'd said, his hand on the doorknob. "Let's give them something to look at." They walked down the center of Main Street, side by side. Every step felt like a drum beat. Porch swings creaked to a halt. Conversations died in the middle of a word. Faces appeared in windows, curtains twitching. It felt like they were walking a gauntlet. The biggest test was the saloon. The batwing doors were propped open, and the noise from inside, a tinny piano, loud laughter, the clink of glasses, spilled out into the street. As they approached, the noise faltered, then died completely. Luke didn't slow down. He didn't hesitate. He walked them right up to those doors, pushed them open, and led her inside. The silence was so thick you could taste the dust in it. Every eye in that smoke-filled room was on them, on her face. Luke led them to the very center of the room, right by the pot-bellied stove. Then he stopped. He turned to her, and in front of God and everyone in Ironwood Junction, he took her hand, lacing his scarred fingers through hers. He raised his voice, not shouting, but clear and strong enough for every corner of the room to hear. "Her name is Nora Hayes," he said, "and she isn't hiding from any of you." He squeezed her hand. "If you can't bear to look at her, then you can turn your own damn heads." A man at the bar cleared his throat. Someone else let out a low curse under his breath. But nobody moved. Nobody spoke a word against him. Against them. Luke held their gaze for a long moment. Then he tipped his hat to the stunned bartender, nodded once to the piano player, and without letting go of her hand, he led her back out into the street. The sky had deepened to a soft lavender. The first stars were starting to appear, sharp and bright. They stopped in the shadows of the blacksmith shop, away from the main street. Her hand was still wrapped in his. It felt like the only solid thing in the world. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He looked down at her, the last light of day catching the sharp line of his jaw, the pale lightening of his scar. "Yes," he said, his voice low and certain. "I did." "Why?" His gaze was intense, searching. "Because you're not something to be ashamed of, Nora." He paused, and his next words hit her right in the center of her chest. "I don't give a damn what they think, but I care about what you think. I care about what you believe." She didn't have an answer for that. She didn't need one, because her fingers tightened around his, and for the first time since the fire, she let someone see her, really see all of her, and she didn't feel the need to flinch. She just felt held. The day had started so well. The sun was warm, the air was crisp, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Nora had walked into town alone, and she hadn't felt afraid. She'd gone to the mercantile for flour and thread, and Mrs. Gable, the storekeeper's wife, had actually smiled at her. A real smile. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. She was just stepping out of the store, a brown paper parcel tucked under her arm, when she saw him. He was leaning against a hitching post, and the sight of him made the warm day turn to ice. It wasn't Charles Pennington, it was someone worse. Someone from the life before the fire. Calvin Morin, the man she was supposed to marry back in Kansas. His boots were scuffed, his coat was threadbare, and even from 10 feet away, she could smell the sour stench of cheap whiskey. He pushed himself off the post, a slow, desperate grin spreading across his face. "Well, I'll be," he drawled, his eyes bloodshot. "Thought I saw a ghost. But no, it's just my little runaway bride." Nora froze on the boardwalk. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "I didn't run, Calvin," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "You sent me away." He chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Details, details. A man can make mistakes. I was young, scared." His gaze swept over her, lingering with a clinical cruelty on her scar. "Still a bit of a shock to the system, I'll admit. A real shame. You were such a pretty little thing." Once. Before she could form a reply, another voice cut in, sharp and cold as a winter wind. "She still is." Luke. He stepped out from the alleyway beside the saloon, where he must have been talking to the blacksmith. He moved with a quiet deadliness, his arms folded, his eyes as hard as granite. Calvin raised an eyebrow, his drunken smirk unwavering. "And who's this? Your new keeper? Looks like you found another charity case, Nora." Luke didn't rise to the bait. He walked forward until he was standing between Nora and Calvin, a solid wall of quiet fury. "Still the same mutt, Morin," Luke said, his voice dangerously low. "All bark." Calvin's smirk vanished. His fist came up, fast but clumsy, fueled by whiskey and wounded pride. It caught Luke on the side of the mouth. Nora gasped. A small crowd was starting to gather, drawn by the promise of a fight. But Luke didn't even flinch. He just stood there taking the punch. A single drop of blood welled at the corner of his lip. He slowly wiped it away with the back of his hand. "You're not worth the trouble," Luke said, his voice flat. Calvin sneered, emboldened by Luke's lack of reaction. "What's the matter? She got you on a leash? Or maybe you just like your women pre-ruined. Makes a broken man like you feel whole, does it?" And that was it. That was the line. But Luke didn't do what everyone expected. He didn't swing. Not yet. First, he did something that stunned the entire street into absolute silence. He turned to Nora. In front of Calvin, in front of the gathering crowd, he gently cupped her face in his hand, and he leaned in and pressed his lips to her scar. It wasn't a quick peck. It was a slow, deliberate, tender kiss. A kiss of reverence, a kiss that said, "This is not ugly. This is not a flaw. This is a part of you, and I honor it." The hush that fell over Main Street was deafening. Jaws dropped, eyes widened. Then, and only then, did Luke turn back to Calvin. The punch was a blur of motion. It wasn't a wild, angry swing. It was short, clean, and precise. The crack of knuckles on bone echoed in the silence. Calvin's head snapped to the side. His knees buckled, and he collapsed into the dust of the street like a sack of grain. Out cold. Nobody cheered. Nobody laughed. They just stared. Because it wasn't the punch that had shocked them. It was the kiss. Luke looked down at the unconscious man, his jaw tight. "Stay gone this time," he said, his voice a low growl. Then he turned to Nora, his expression softening instantly. He held out his hand. She took it without a single thought. Together they turned and walked away, right through the stunned, silent crowd. And as they walked, Nora knew. That kiss had been for her, but it had also been for them. It was a message to the whole world. She was not his charity case. She was his. Back at the bunkhouse, Nora dabbed at the cut on Luke's lip with a damp cloth. Her hands were still trembling. "You didn't have to," she whispered. He caught her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. "Yes, I did." "Why, Luke? Why the kiss?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. "You ever see where a man tried to carve his name into a living tree?" he asked. She looked at him, confused. "He thinks he's leaving a permanent mark," Luke continued, his voice soft. "But he's not. The tree, it doesn't just sit there and wear the scar. It keeps growing. It heals around the wound. Sometimes over years it covers the mark completely until you'd never even know it was there." He reached up with his free hand and gently, so gently, touched her cheek. Not the scar itself, but the smooth skin right beside it. "He tried to carve his name on you, Nora. Him, the fire, all of them. but you're still growing. You're still healing." His eyes held hers, and the truth in them was so powerful it took her breath away. "You're still the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, and nobody gets to carve their worth onto you. Only you." A tear she hadn't realized she was holding back slipped down her cheek, and for the first time, it wasn't a tear of shame or sorrow. It was a tear of release, and she finally, truly believed him. The letter was on the table, a single folded page, her neat, careful script filling the space. She packed in the pre-dawn grayness, moving like a ghost through the small bunkhouse. Just the essentials. The dress Luke had bought her, the one with tiny blue flowers embroidered on the collar. The shawl that had kept her warm on so many lonely nights. She folded them gently, her hands moving with a heavy slowness. The silence in the room was a living thing. It felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath, asking her a question she couldn't answer. Why? She couldn't stay. She wouldn't be the anchor that dragged him down. The fight with Calvin had proven it. Trouble would always find her, and as long as she was with Luke, it would find him too. He deserved a life of peace, not a life of defending her honor from ghosts and whispers. She would not be the scar on his life. She slipped out the door as the first hint of light touched the eastern sky. Her boots were silent on the dirt path. She didn't look back. Looking back would break her. She made it past the corral, past the old cedar fence, and into the stand of pines that marked the edge of his land. The air was cold and clean, and it hurt to breathe. By mid-morning, she had reached the creek. It was a place they had come to once, a quiet spot where wildflowers grew in stubborn, colorful clusters along the banks. She sat down on a smooth, flat rock, wrapping her arms around her knees. The water whispered over the stones, a sound that was supposed to be peaceful, but it just made her feel more alone. She had wanted to disappear, but the world wouldn't let her. She didn't hear him approach, but she felt his presence, a change in the air, a stillness. She looked up, and there he was, standing on the opposite bank. His horse was tethered to a tree behind him. In one hand he held her letter. It was still folded, unopened. "I didn't read it," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the rushing water. Her heart seized in her chest. She slowly got to her feet. You shouldn't have followed me." "I figured," he said, ignoring her protest, "that if you were truly gone, the words wouldn't matter. And if I found you, I'd rather you tell me to my face." He found a set of stepping stones and crossed the creek, his movements sure and steady. He stopped a few feet from her. Her voice was a raw, broken thing. "I was trying to go quietly." "You succeeded," he said, his eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't name. "Too well, waking up to a cold hearth and an empty bed. It damn near tore the heart out of me, Nora." Tears pricked her eyes. "I'm scared, Luke." "I know. No, not of them. Not anymore. I'm scared for you. I see the way people look at you now, like I've tainted you, like I'm some kind of burden you've chosen to carry, and they can't understand why." She gave a choked, bitter laugh. "They look at you, and they see a man who could have had anything, any life, any woman, and you ended up with—" Her hand automatically went to her cheek, her fingers tracing the ragged line of the scar. "With me." He was silent for a long, painful moment. She thought he was going to agree with her. She thought he was going to let her go. "Do you know what I carried home from the war, Nora?" he asked finally, his voice quiet and intense. She looked up, startled. "It wasn't just this." He touched his own scarred cheek. "It was ghosts, names of men I couldn't save, nights I couldn't sleep. I spent years just drifting, riding from one town to the next, never staying long enough for anything to matter. I was running, but I didn't even know what from." He took a step closer, and his eyes bored into hers. "Then you got off that train, broken and terrified, and so damn proud you wouldn't let a single tear fall. You stood there and took all that hate, and you didn't shatter." His voice dropped to a raw whisper. "You, Nora Hayes. You are the first reason I've had to stop running. You're the first thing that's ever felt like home." Her breath hitched. A sob escaped her. "I didn't want to make you choose." "You didn't," he said, his voice firm. He closed the distance between them, his hands coming up to cup her face, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. I chose. I chose you the moment I saw you stand up to that coward on the platform. I chose you when you didn't flinch from my scars. I chose you every morning I woke up and you were still here. He still held the unopened letter. With one hand he tore it in half, then in half again, and let the pieces fall into the creek. The current caught them and carried them away. Your turn to choose, he said softly. Are you my home, Nora? Or am I just another place you are passing through? She looked into his eyes and she saw her own brokenness reflected there, and she saw his love, fierce and unwavering. She reached up, her trembling hand covering his, pressing it tighter against her scarred skin. I stopped running, she whispered. The moment I walked into your bunkhouse, I was just too afraid to admit it. He leaned in and pressed his forehead against hers. They stood there for a long time, the creek rushing around their feet, the wildflowers blooming at their sides. They weren't two broken people anymore. They were two halves of something that had finally, against all odds, been made whole. There was no church, no flowers, no music, no crowd of smiling faces. Their only guests were a hawk circling high overhead and a grizzled old innkeeper named Will, who had a preacher's license from a past life he didn't like to talk about. Their altar was an ancient cottonwood tree at the edge of Luke's pasture, its branches stretching out like sheltering arms. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, dappling the ground in gold. Nora wore a simple ivory dress, the one Luke had bought her. She'd hemmed it herself by firelight. There was no veil to hide behind. There was no need for one anymore. Luke stood beside her, his best shirt buttoned to the collar, his hands scrubbed clean but still rough with calluses. He looked at her, not like a man who had rescued a stray, but like a man who had just found a treasure he'd been searching for his whole life. Will cleared his throat, holding a small battered book. Well, he said, his voice gravelly, I ain't much for fancy words, but I've seen baling wire hold a fence together stronger than some folks' promises. And what I see here, this is stronger than wire. He looked from Luke to Nora. Go on, son. Luke took a deep breath. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He didn't pull out a ring. He pulled out a small folded square of white silk. His big, rough hands unfolded it with a surprising delicacy. The fabric was yellowed with age, but along the edge in a soft blue thread were two elegantly stitched initials. N.H. Nora gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth. It was her mother's handkerchief, the last thing she had made before she passed, the one thing Nora had treasured above all else, the one thing she thought had been lost forever in the fire. I don't understand, she whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. It was in my apron pocket. It burned with everything else. Luke's voice was gentle. Not everything that burns is gone for good. He looked at her, and now he revealed the final piece of the puzzle, the secret he'd held for years. I wasn't just at Shiloh, Nora. Before the war, I was a volunteer fireman in a small town in Kansas. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. You were there? That night? He nodded slowly. I was one of the men who pulled you from the house. In all the chaos, I saw this on the ground, away from the flames. I picked it up. I asked around for months who it belonged to, but you and your family were already gone. His gaze was filled with a decade of unspoken wonder. I kept it. All these years. I don't know why. I just felt like it was important. I never knew. Until the night you told me your story. I never knew it was you. She reached out with a trembling hand and took the handkerchief. The soft silk was like a ghost of her past, a tangible link to the life she had lost. But it wasn't a ghost anymore. It was a miracle. Fate. Destiny. Whatever it was, it had brought them here, to this exact spot under this tree. He hadn't just saved her from the cold a few months ago. He had saved a piece of her soul all those years ago. Tears streamed down her face now, but they were tears of overwhelming, impossible joy. He had been her guardian angel all along. So did I, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. When he looked at her, confused, she clarified, I thought I was lost too, until I found you. Will, the old innkeeper, sniffed loudly and made a great show of wiping his nose on his sleeve. They didn't need rings. They didn't need fancy vows. They just needed this truth. Luke took her hands in his. You were beautiful the first time I saw you, Nora, he said, his voice thick with emotion, covered in soot, fighting for breath. But you were beautiful then, and you're even more beautiful now. You, she said, her voice shaking but clear, made me believe that even the things the world throws away as worthless are still worthy of love. Will cleared his throat again. Well then, he grumbled, though his eyes were suspiciously bright, by the power vested in me, by not much of anything but common sense, I pronounce you man and wife. Luke didn't wait for permission. He stepped forward and he kissed her. A deep, soulful kiss that tasted of promises kept, and a future that was suddenly, dazzlingly bright. And in that moment, under the cottonwood tree, with the hawk as their witness, they weren't the scarred man and the disfigured woman anymore. They were just Luke and Nora, and they were finally home. By the next summer, the whispers in Ironwood Junction had died out, replaced by a grudging, then a genuine respect. Nora started teaching the town's children how to read in the old abandoned schoolhouse. Her scar was just a part of her face, like the freckles on young Timmy Gable's nose. The children only knew that Mrs. Carter told the best stories and sometimes brought honey cakes on Fridays. Luke's blacksmith shop behind their now expanded house became the heart of the town. He was quiet and fair, and his work was strong. People came for a new wagon wheel and stayed for his steady, calm advice. They had built a life not in spite of their scars, but because of them. Their shared pain had become the foundation for a love that was as solid and real as the mountains that surrounded them. One evening, as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold, a dusty rider approached. It was Charles Pennington. He was thinner, his expensive coat now frayed and stained. He dismounted, holding his hat in his hands like a beggar. He'd made a series of bad investments they'd heard, and lost everything. He stood before the porch, his eyes fixed on Nora. He saw her not hidden behind a veil, but sitting in the golden light, her head resting on her husband's shoulder, a look of deep, unshakable peace on her face, and he finally saw what he had thrown away. Nora, he began, his voice cracking, I was a fool, a cruel, arrogant fool. Can you ever forgive me? Nora looked at him for a long moment. There was no anger in her eyes, no hatred. There wasn't even pity. There was just nothing. He held no power over her anymore. She didn't say a word. She just squeezed Luke's hand. Luke stood up, not menacingly, but with a finality that was absolute. I think it's time for you to go, he said, his voice quiet but unyielding. Charles looked from Luke's strong, protective stance to Nora's serene face, and he finally understood. He had come seeking forgiveness to ease his own conscience, but he had found something else entirely, a justice he couldn't fight. He turned and rode away, a shrunken figure disappearing into the twilight. Nora leaned her head back against Luke's chest. I used to dream of that moment, she said softly, of him seeing what he lost. And now? Luke asked, his arms wrapping around her. Now, she said, a small, happy smile touching her lips. I just feel sorry for him. He's looking for a pretty face. He'll never find a home. She turned in his arms, her hand coming up to rest on his scarred cheek. Some people think scars are a sign of weakness. They think it's something that makes you less. She leaned in and kissed his scar, just as he had once kissed hers in the middle of Main Street. They're wrong. Scars mean you were wounded, yes, but they also mean you were strong enough to heal. He held her close as the last light faded and the stars came out, one by one. They didn't need anything else. They had faced down the fire, the whispers, and the ghosts of their past, and they had won. If their story shows us anything, it's that the world will try to tell you what beauty is. It will try to tell you what you're worth based on a smooth surface. But real value, real love, isn't about avoiding the fire. It's about who walks into the embers to find you, and who isn't afraid to love the scars the flames left behind. If you believe in a love that's stronger than shame and deeper than skin, then you've found your tribe. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss another story of unbreakable love from the heart of the wild. And let us know in the comments, what's a scar, visible or not, that has made you stronger? Until next time, love fiercely. And remember that sometimes the most broken things can be put back together to create something more beautiful than ever before.